Most people think the supernatural begins with angels and demons, as if the world started with the stories we were taught. But the truth is much older and far more unsettling. Before heaven and hell, before divine punishment and salvation, there were spirits that simply were. They didn't belong to light or to darkness. They had no desire to guide, reward, tempt, or destroy. They existed in silence, waiting. And some people today can still feel them, even if they don't know the name of what is touching their life. Have you ever felt watched in an empty room, or woken up unable to move, as if something was sitting beside your bed? Have you ever stepped through a doorway and felt a pause in the air, a moment where reality seemed to hold its breath? You may have told yourself it was just your imagination. Everyone does. But the Sumerians, the first civilization to map the unseen world, they knew better. They recorded these beings long before the idea of demons ever existed. They called them spirits older than gods, older than creation myths, older than the human concept of good or evil. And they warned that these spirits do not look for worship. They look for awareness. They appear where the world begins to fracture, when the mind grows tired, when the soul feels thin, when silence starts to feel crowded. Most people think they found this knowledge out of curiosity, but those who truly understand recognize something different. You don't find them. They notice you first. There is a moment when a person realizes that not everything in the unseen world fits into the familiar categories of angels and demons. Before the idea of holy light or eternal darkness, there were beings that simply existed, without allegiance, purpose, or moral alignment. In the oldest fragments of Sumerian magic, these ancient Sumer spirits were described not as deities, but as presences, aware, patient, observing. When one stands in silence long enough, there is a subtle instinct that whispers, something else is here. It is not fear, it is not comfort, it is recognition. A memory older than memory itself. Humans created language to explain what they feared, admired and worshipped, but some forces were known long before language existed. These Sumerian spirits, elder than demons, do not communicate through words or visions, but through a shift in the air, a pressure in the stomach, or the sudden awareness that one is being perceived. Imagine stepping into an empty room and feeling as though the walls themselves are thinking. These beings were never meant to be categorized. They are not benevolent guides nor malicious hunters. They are witnesses. When the first civilizations formed belief systems, they tried to assign identity, intention, and role to every invisible presence. But some presences resisted definition. These dangerous spirits of Sumer were never part of the cosmic struggle between good and evil. That conflict came later, much later, once humanity had shaped moral myths around the unknown. Instead, these ancient magic rituals of Sumer focused on acknowledging a force that could not be influenced. You did not pray to these spirits. You endured them. The most unsettling part is how natural the encounter feels. It does not feel like meeting something other. It feels like remembering someone you once knew, but cannot place. The ancient tablets describe this sensation as a return of awareness, as if the soul recognizes a presence that predates it. Mystical Mesopotamia spirits were not encountered visually. They were felt, and the feeling sank into the bones, heavy and undeniable. People didn't ask, "And what is it?" They asked, "How do I step carefully in its presence?" To put this into relatable terms, think of the silence that comes before a storm. The sky dims, the wind stills, and the world holds its breath. Nothing has happened yet, but the body knows something is happening. Spiritual warfare in ancient Sumer was not a battle of wills, but a negotiation with inevitability. These ancient spirits beyond demons did not seek worship or resistance. They simply were, and one either adapted to their presence or shattered beneath it. There was no conversation, only coexistence, fragile and temporary. Those who encountered these Babylonian occult entities often came away changed. Their eyes held a distant awareness, as though they had seen the foundations beneath existence. Some became priests, learning the silent arts of acknowledgement and containment. Others fled society entirely, unable to live among people who had never felt such raw neutrality of being. To them, the world felt loud, crowded, artificial. When you meet something that predates creation, everyday life seems small. And perhaps the most intriguing part is this: The body remembers these encounters even across generations. Instinct is ancestral memory. When someone feels watched in an empty room, or when they suddenly pause without knowing why, they may be brushing against the same energies ancient Sumerians recorded thousands of years ago. The echoes are still here. They never left. And what comes next is understanding how a civilization tried to live alongside them, long before heaven and hell divided the unseen into sides. When people talk about ancient civilizations, they often imagine grand temples, kings with jeweled crowns, and myths carved into stone. But Sumer was different. Sumer was the first world that tried to map the invisible instead of worshipping it blindly. They didn't kneel in awe before the unknown. They studied it. The priests of that era understood that the universe was not divided into good spirits and evil spirits. Instead, they saw the world as filled with currents, forces, and presences, including ancient Sumer spirits elder than demons, each with their own nature and rhythm. This is why Sumerian magic feels so unsettling compared to later religious systems. The priests did not treat the unseen like gods to adore. They treated them like powerful neighbors. You did not beg them for blessings. You negotiated terms. This meant acknowledging that some Babylonian occult entities could not be bribed, flattered, or convinced. They respected strength, boundaries, and awareness, not worship. The Sumerians understood something modern spirituality often forgets. Reverence is not submission, reverence is recognition. The oldest temples in Ur and Eridu were not built for praise. They were built to create controlled meeting grounds, neutral zones where human and spirit could interact without overwhelming one another. The architecture itself was symbolic. Narrow entrances, enclosed chambers, no grand altars. These places were not theaters of devotion. They were laboratories, spaces where ancient magic rituals of Sumer were conducted to measure spiritual presence, like one measures storms or tides. The priests were researchers, not believers. Imagine a culture where children grew up learning that the world had layers, that what you see is only a thin surface, stretched over something deeper. The mystical Mesopotamia spirits were part of everyday awareness, not feared like monsters under a bed, but acknowledged like the desert wind or the rising flood. You could not see them unless they wanted to be seen, but their influence shaped harvests, health, dreams, and emotions. This was not superstition. It was sensitivity. One story preserved in cuneiform tablets describes a priest teaching an apprentice using a clay bowl filled with water. He told the apprentice to wait until the water stilled completely. Then he whispered, "Now listen for what is behind the silence." This wasn't metaphor. This was training to perceive ancient spirits beyond demons. Instead of summoning, the Sumerians learned to notice. In a world where everything wants attention, noticing is power. The high priests who specialized in dealing with dangerous spirits, Sumer were not elite due to wealth or status. They were chosen because they possessed the rare ability to remain calm in the presence of the unshaped, to feel the presence of the Utuku Edimurabisu and not crumble. Their minds did not break when they perceived something beyond human format. To them, the invisible was not terrifying. It was familiar, like a childhood memory that refuses to fade completely. And here is the important transition. The Sumerians did not believe the world belonged to humans. They believed the world was shared. They walked carefully, spoke thoughtfully, and rested knowing that ancient spirits beyond demons moved alongside them in silence. Before heaven and hell, before gods demanded obedience, before demons demanded fear, there was coexistence, uneasy, precarious, and real. And it is from this understanding that the next revelation emerges. The world has been distracted by the wrong beings entirely. Modern culture loves the word Anunnaki. It appears in documentaries, conspiracy theories, sci-fi books, and late-night conversations about ancient aliens. But the truth is far more unsettling than the internet version. The Sumerians themselves did not fear the Anunnaki. They respected them, yes, as forces of creation and order, but they did not tremble before them. The real fear was reserved for the silent ones behind them, the ancient Sumer spirits elder than demons themselves, the ones who existed before there were thrones, laws, or mythic hierarchies. The obsession with the Anunnaki is convenient because it focuses attention upward, on gods, kings, and celestial dramas. But Sumerian magic teaches something different. The most dangerous forces are those without names, titles, or cosmic agendas. The Igigi, for example, were not creators or destroyers. They were watchers, witnesses, observers who never intervened, never punished, never rewarded. And something that watches without reacting is far more terrifying than something that acts with purpose. Indifference is the purest form of power. Imagine being in a room with someone who does not blink, speak, or move, yet you know they are aware of you. That is the energy of the Igigi, a presence that makes the soul tighten, the breath shorten. These Babylonian occult entities were not concerned with morality, worship, or devotion. They watched civilizations rise and collapse with the same calm attention someone gives to a candle burning down. They represent a kind of ancient stillness, not peaceful, but eternal. And eternity is not kind. People assume the supernatural always seeks influence. They imagine spirits whispering, guiding, tempting. But the ancient magic rituals of Sumer reveal something much colder. Some beings have no interest in interaction at all. They simply exist alongside us, like deep ocean creatures existing below human awareness. Their presence is not a threat until you realize you have been seen. Recognizing this changes how one understands spiritual warfare in ancient Sumer. It wasn't about fighting or worshipping. It was about avoiding being noticed. The silent ones, as some clay tablets call them, did not have form. They appeared only as distortions of perception, a shift in shadow, a flicker at the edge of vision, a sudden drop in temperature. To describe them visually would be like trying to draw the concept of waiting. Mystical Mesopotamia spirits often lacked shape because they predated the idea of shape. They existed before the world had edges. They are older than demons, older than gods, older than story itself. You cannot describe what existed before description. And this is why focusing on the Anunnaki is safe. They have names, roles, myths. Even if powerful, they are comprehensible. The forces we are discussing now are not. They are ancient spirits beyond demons, beyond identity, beyond narrative. They do not ask to be understood, and cannot be. To study them is to study the silence behind reality, the static in the void, the thought before thought. The Sumerians understood that turning your attention toward them was like staring too long into deep water. Eventually, something stares back. This realization shaped how Sumerian priests behaved. Their goal was not to summon or converse with such beings. It was to avoid drawing the attention of what should remain distant. But history shows humanity has a way of seeking what it should not touch. And this is where the story begins to shift. From witnesses to those who entered the world of dust, the places where suffering opened pathways and where presence became manifestation. In ancient Mesopotamia, people didn't fear the firestorms or the serpents of the desert as much as they feared what followed them. The Sumerians believed that suffering itself was a beacon, a signal that called certain beings into the world. These were the Utukku, spirits born from trauma, drought, famine, loss, and war. They were not summoned, invoked, or commanded through Sumerian magic. They arrived when despair settled deeply into a place or a person. When the land cracked and the air turned still, the ancient Sumer spirits elder than demons were said to walk among the ruins. What made the Utukku terrifying wasn't aggression, it was inevitability. They did not choose victims. They appeared where suffering had already dug its roots. Imagine a village recovering from plague, the silence after the last funeral, the wind moving through abandoned homes. In that silence, something breathes. These dangerous spirits of Sumer were described as the dust that remembers. They were the afterimage of pain itself, not ghosts, not demons, but echoes with awareness. Unlike the entities worshipped or bargained with, the Utukku did not respond to offerings, sacrifices, or prayers. This is what truly frightened Sumerian priests. Most spirits in Sumerian demonology could be placated, redirected, or negotiated with, but not these. The Utukku did not care about devotion or ritual. Their nature was anchored in imbalance. If suffering had happened, they stayed. If suffering continued, they fed. They were not merciful or cruel, merely present. That was their horror. People today might interpret these descriptions as metaphor, psychological wounds, lingering grief, generational trauma. And yes, The Sumerians understood those too, but they also believed suffering had weight, shape, and gravity in the unseen world. A house where a tragedy happened did not simply feel heavy, it became inhabited. Mystical Mesopotamia spirits did not need to be seen to be felt. They were like humidity in the air, invisible but oppressive, impossible to ignore once noticed. Think about the modern world: abandoned hospitals, war zones, homes where loneliness echoes through empty rooms. People walk into those spaces and say, "It feels wrong here." They are re-experiencing what ancient priests documented thousands of years ago. The Utuku Idimu Rabisu were not legends. They were patterns woven into the emotional fabric of existence. Where pain lingers, presence follows. You've felt this before, even if you never had words for it. The Sumerians taught that the most dangerous aspect of the Utuku was not that they harmed the living directly, but that they influenced emotion. Someone exposed to their presence might lose motivation, lose appetite, withdraw from others, dream of dust and empty roads. Not nightmares, just nothingness. These ancient spirits beyond demons did not attack. They eroded, slowly, patiently, like desert wind shaping stone over centuries. To the Sumerians, this was far more terrifying than violence, and this leads to a quiet truth. Suffering itself can be a doorway. When a person breaks, when they feel hollow, when they stop reaching outward, something begins to watch from the silence inside. The next topic explores a specific manifestation of this: the Adimu, the breath stealers, beings not sensed during waking life, but in the moment between sleep and awareness, in the paralysis where reality blurs and presence presses close. The Adimu were not feared because they attacked. They were feared because they entered unnoticed. In Sumerian magic, the Adimu were described as spirits of those who died without rest, those who were not mourned, not honored, or not remembered. They are the lingering hunger of unfinished lives. These ancient Sumer spirits, elder than demons, did not roam openly. They slipped through the threshold of sleep. Imagine lying in bed, your body heavy, your mind floating between waking and dreaming, and suddenly you cannot move. Something is watching, not threatening, just present. Many today call this sleep paralysis, shadow figures, or the sense of being pinned to the mattress. But the Sumerians documented this experience thousands of years ago with unsettling precision. They believed the Edimu sat on the chest of the living and drank the warmth of their breath. Not air, vitality, life force, the part of you that makes you you. These dangerous spirits of Sumer were not violent hunters. They were empty vessels. And emptiness seeks fullness. The Babylonian occult entities known as Edimu did not respond to offerings or prayers because they had no desires. They weren't driven by malice or hunger. They were defined by absence. Their presence is cold, not because they bring death, but because they carry the echo of a life that never had the chance to complete itself. If the Utuku were the spirits of wounded places, the Edimu were the spirits of unfinished hearts. That's why their effect was subtle yet devastating. Exhaustion, sadness, disconnection, dreams of grey landscapes with no sound. Here is where the connection to modern experience becomes impossible to ignore. Anyone who has woken up unable to move, seeing a shadow sitting beside the bed, or feeling watched in the dark knows the sensation. The mind screams, but the body refuses. The air feels thick. The room holds its breath. Mystical Mesopotamia spirits were said to press the boundary between life and death, not fully stepping into either. And this is why the Edimu feel so close, closer than fear, closer than memory. They feel familiar. The Sumerians taught that the Edimu appear when a person is emotionally drained, grieving, or isolated, not because the spirit was called, but because the boundary between worlds thins when the heart is tired. In ancient magic rituals of Sumer, one did not summon protection, one rebuilt vitality. Sleep, food, sunlight, laughter, these were prescriptions, not poetry. To restore breath was to become unappetizing to the breath stealers. Healing was a form of spiritual warfare in ancient Sumer. Think about this in your own life. When you're exhausted, disconnected, or numb, the world feels heavier. Shadows seem to stay longer. Silence feels crowded. The Edimu do not come to torment. They come to fill the silence you leave inside yourself. This is why the Sumerian priests taught that remembering the dead was vital, not to honor them, but to keep them from becoming Edimu. Memory was both anchor and mercy. And this brings us to an even more unsettling presence, the Rabisu. While the Adimu come in the breathless stillness of sleep, the Rabisu wait at the edges, doorways, mirrors, thresholds, transitions. If the Adimu enter when the inner world collapses, the Rabisu appear where the outer world shifts. They watch not the sleeping, but the crossing. The Rabisu were not spirits that wandered freely. They waited, not in graveyards or temples, but in thresholds, the spaces between, doorways, mirrors, stairwells, gates, and places where one state becomes another. In Sumerian magic, thresholds were considered the most vulnerable points of existence because identity shifts slightly when crossing them. These ancient Sumer spirits, elder than demons, were seen as sentinels of transition. They did not chase or pursue. They simply remained poised in silence, aware of every passing presence. The Sumerians believed the Rabisu were the watchers of becoming. To understand the Rabisu is to understand that reality is not continuous. There are fractures, small ones, where the self loosens. When someone is about to fall asleep, waking from a dream, entering a new home, standing in front of a mirror late at night, or stepping across a doorway, the inner balance shifts. The Babylonian occult entities known as Rabisu were drawn to these shifts in awareness. They were not inherently hostile, but they noticed when a soul flickered, and noticing, for them, was the first step to approaching. The Sumerians believed that these dangerous spirits of Sumer observed not the body, but the state of the mind. The more distracted, tired, uncertain, or emotionally open someone was, the more visible their presence became to the Rabisu. Imagine walking into your home after a long day, pausing in the doorway, feeling as though someone is already inside watching you, not because there is a sound, but because the air feels occupied. That moment of hesitation is where the Rabisu exist, not in the room, in the shift. Mirrors played a significant role in ancient magic rituals of Sumer because the Sumerians did not see reflections as mere images. They believed mirrors showed the boundary between the self and the unseen. When one looks into a mirror at night, tired, unfocused, the face can look unfamiliar for a brief moment. The priest said, "If your reflection pauses when you do not, step away." Mystical Mesopotamia spirits did not need to appear. The uncertainty itself was a doorway. The Rabisu were also associated with altered states, psychedelics, trance, fever, grief, or overwhelming joy. Any moment where identity softens or reality becomes fluid was considered a threshold. This relates deeply to spiritual warfare in ancient Sumer. The fight was not against a being, but against the moment when the self becomes unguarded. The Rabisu did not seek worship or fear. They sought opportunity, not to harm, but to witness the places where identity dissolves and reforms. In practical terms, the Sumerians developed rituals not to banish the Rabisu, but to announce themselves when crossing a threshold. Stepping into a home, they spoke their name aloud. Looking into a mirror at night, they acknowledged their reflection. This was not superstition. It was grounding, a way to prevent the ancient spirits beyond demons from interpreting vulnerability as invitation. Today, people do something similar without realizing it. Turning on a light before entering a dark room, clearing the throat before speaking to an empty space, shifting posture when passing a mirror. Instinct remembers. But where the Rabisu waited at boundaries, there was another truth the Sumerians guarded closely. These spirits were not meant to be befriended or worshipped. They were weather, inevitable, powerful, indifferent. And because of this, the priests of Sumer did not seek devotion. They sought control, not dominance, not power. Control, the thin line between drowning in a storm and learning to breathe within it. And this sets the stage for the next revelation. Sumerian magic was never a religion. It was a system of containment. Most people today imagine ancient religions as systems of devotion, prayer, praise, and obedience. But Sumerian magic was never about worshipping gods or spirits. It was about maintaining boundaries. The priests of Sumer saw the unseen world the same way sailors see the ocean. Vast, powerful, unpredictable, and not something to adore, but something to respect. These ancient Sumer spirits, elder than demons, were understood as forces, not personalities. The Sumerians believed that to survive, one had to recognize power without surrendering to it. This is why Sumerian magic looks so strange compared to later religions. There were no hymns of devotion to the dangerous spirits of Sumer, no long poetic praises, no begging for mercy. Instead, there were binding rituals, containment symbols, and contracts. The priests negotiated the way one negotiates with a storm. You don't ask the storm to love you. You build levees strong enough to avoid being swept away. Sumerian demonology was not mythology. It was engineering, spiritual engineering. The Babylonian occult entities were never seen as higher or holier. They were simply older, older than morality, older than narrative, older than divine hierarchies. To treat them like gods would have been foolish, like bowing to an earthquake or asking a river for affection. Instead, the goal of ancient magic rituals of Sumer was to create structure where there was none, to define edges where the world wanted to dissolve. A priest did not say, "Bjorga, protect me." A priest said, you stay here and I stay here. This mindset changes everything. Where later civilizations prayed, the Sumerians measured. They observed patterns in dream cycles, illness, drought, and emotional shifts. They paid attention to how mystical Mesopotamia spirits influenced mood, sleep, memory, and thought. They understood that the invisible did not need bodies to touch reality. Influence was enough. So instead of trying to remove these spirits, the priests learned to channel and redirect their presence. Spiritual warfare in ancient Sumer was not a battle, it was balancing pressure. To illustrate this in modern terms, think of how electricity is handled. No one tries to defeat electricity. They contain it with wiring, shape it through circuits, and use grounding rods to prevent disaster. The Sumerians treated ancient spirits beyond demons in the same way. The power was always there, vast and constant, but the interaction had to be carefully controlled. Those who lacked discipline, focus, or emotional stability were never allowed near this knowledge. They would be overwhelmed. This is also why personal responsibility was considered sacred in Sumerian magic. A priest could not be someone who panicked, doubted, or collapsed under pressure. To stand in the presence of the unseen required a still mind and steadiness of breath. Because if the priest lost control of themselves, they would lose control of the ritual. The boundary would break. And once a boundary breaks, the spirit is no longer something one observes. It is something one survives. Control was life. Control was everything. And yet, the Sumerians pushed further, because knowing how to control a force is one thing. Containing one is another. Which brings us to one of the most dangerous practices ever recorded, a ritual so feared that many scribes refused to write it in full, the method of sealing a spirit inside clay. The Sumerians believed that some spirits could not be reasoned with, redirected, or avoided. When a presence lingered too strongly, when a place felt permanently heavy, when a mind became too fractured, or when suffering refused to fade, there was only one final option: containment. This is where the ritual of the sealed jar emerges, one of the most dangerous practices recorded in Sumerian magic. The idea was simple in theory, but terrifying in implication. Trap the presence inside matter. A clay jar, carved with binding sigils, sealed with pitch and ash. But simple does not mean safe. Unlike worship rituals, this rite required direct confrontation. The priest had to focus their attention entirely on the ancient Sumer spirit's elder than demons they sought to contain. Attention was the rope. Identity was the container. The jar was just the anchor. The priest would sit in silence, breathing slowly, allowing the presence to gather around them. The dangerous spirits of Sumer were drawn not by offerings, but by stillness. A stillness that told the unseen, "I am aware of you. I see you." And when seen, the spirit leaned closer. Once contact was established, the priest used chant not to summon, but to compress. The words were rhythmic, grounded, repetitive, designed to guide the spirit into a narrower and narrower conceptual space. This is not metaphor. In Sumerian demonology, presence could be shaped like clay, as long as the priest never broke concentration. The Babylonian occult entities were not bound through force, but through boundary. You do not overpower a storm. You redirect the wind until it spirals inward. The jar itself was prepared carefully. The clay was shaped by someone who had never experienced grief, anger, or fear, because emotion left residue. The inside was inscribed with sigils representing enclosure, finality, and silence. The outside bore marks of identity, the priest's name, lineage, and purpose. Ancient magic rituals of Sumer emphasized this. A container is only as strong as the self that seals it. If the priest lacked discipline, the jar cracked, and a cracked vessel does not merely fail, it releases. The warning given to every apprentice was simple. Once sealed, the spirit does not weaken, it concentrates. It condenses into something sharper, heavier, and more aware than before. The mystical Mesopotamia spirits inside become like pressure inside stone, silent but immense. If the seal was broken intentionally or by accident, the release wasn't physical, it was psychological. The mind of the one who broke it could fracture instantly, not from attack, but from contact too intense to bear. The Sumerians recorded only a few successful uses of the sealed jar ritual. Most attempts ended in madness, disappearance, or unexplained illness. Spiritual warfare in ancient Sumer was never a dramatic confrontation. It was the thin edge between mastery and collapse. The priests did not fear the spirits. They feared their own inability to hold the boundary. To trap something ancient is to acknowledge that your own mind is the battlefield. You must remain stronger than what you contain, and yet some still tried. Some believed control was achievable. Some believed knowledge was worth the risk. And some learned that containment was never the final defense, because even sealed spirits listen, and sometimes they call back, which leads us to the next and final unveiling. The mind is the real threshold, and certain states of consciousness make that threshold very, very thin. The Sumerians understood something that modern science is only beginning to touch. The mind is not a closed system. It is a doorway, and that doorway can widen or fracture under certain conditions. High fever, grief, isolation, exhaustion, psychedelic visions, sleep paralysis, trauma, meditation gone too deep. All of these were known to thin the boundary between the self and the unseen. In Sumerian magic, these states were not considered hallucinations. They were recognized as exposure to ancient Sumer spirits elder than demons, not summoning, overlapping. A person in these altered states is not seeking contact. They are noticed. The dangerous spirits of Sumer did not need rituals or incantations to appear. They moved where identity loosened. The Babylonian occult entities have always been drawn to vulnerability, not emotional weakness but openness. When the structured self dissolves even slightly, the mind becomes like a house with the door unlatched. Something doesn't need to break in, it only needs to enter. This is why dreams played such an important role in Sumerian demonology. Dreams are thresholds, not imagination. A dream is where memory, fear, longing, and symbol blend into something fluid. The Sumerians believed that mystical Mesopotamia spirits walked freely in dreams because dreams were not bound by physical form. In dreams, the mind can see what the eyes cannot. It can hear what the ears never could. Some dream encounters feel more real than waking life, because something is waking alongside you. When someone experiences sleep paralysis and feels watched, pressed down, or unable to call for help, the modern world calls it a neurological glitch. The Sumerians called it by name, the Adimu noticing you. The ancient magic rituals of Sumer did not try to banish these spirits. Banishing only acknowledges power. Instead, the goal was to restore identity, to bring the self fully back into the body. Breathwork, grounding techniques, touch, sound, these were the first forms of spiritual warfare in ancient Sumer. DMT visions, ecstatic trance states, and psychedelic breakthroughs were also documented by Sumerian scribes as direct crossings. They described fractal landscapes, geometric beings, and presences that felt older than the stars. These beings never introduced themselves. They simply stared. Ancient spirits beyond demons do not communicate with words. They communicate by rearranging thought. The message is not spoken. It is known, instantly and deeply, as if it has always been inside you. But here is the part most people miss. Contact is not a sign of chosen destiny or spiritual awakening. It is simply alignment. A fractured mind is a window, and windows can open both ways. The Sumerians did not see these encounters as blessings. They saw them as risks. To look into the unseen means the unseen looks back, and once something has seen you, the memory of being seen does not fade. It lingers in your breath, in your sleep, in the quiet moments when the world grows still. And that brings us to the final revelation, one the ancient scribes wrote with trembling hands. These spirits never left. They were never banished, defeated, or forgotten. They simply drifted beneath silence, waiting for the world to fracture again. And today the world is fracturing. The conditions that once called them, hunger, confusion, despair, spiritual exhaustion, are returning, which leads to a question older than history. Are you the one who found this knowledge, or were you led to it? Civilizations do not collapse suddenly. They crumble quietly, long before anyone notices. The ancient Sumerians believed that when societies fell into spiritual exhaustion, when people stopped believing in meaning, when hunger and confusion spread, when identity dissolved into noise, the old spirits began to stir, not as invaders, not as conquerors, but as returning witnesses. The ancient Sumer spirits, elder than demons, did not create chaos. They arrived because chaos made space for them. Look at the world today. People feel disconnected, unfocused, hollow. There is a hunger that no wealth, pleasure, or distraction seems to satisfy. Anxiety rises without cause. Sleep feels shallow. Time feels distorted. The dangerous spirits of Sumer were said to move where the human mind begins to fracture under the weight of its own emptiness. The Babylonian occult entities do not break the world. They illuminate what is already breaking. They come when the veil between the inner and outer worlds grows thin. The Sumerians recorded a warning in clay. When the world forgets the sacred, the unseen remembers itself. This did not mean religion. It meant awareness, the ability to sense silence, presence, the unspeaking watcher. Mystical Mesopotamia spirits move like shadows across memory, not to haunt, but to be acknowledged. When people stop remembering themselves, these spirits remember for them, and that is the most terrifying form of recognition. Some people today feel these presences not as visions, but as sensations, a sudden heaviness in the chest, a flicker in the edge of vision, a dream that feels older than your life, a moment where the world seems to pause and look back at you. These are the same signs described in ancient magic rituals of Sumer. Nothing has changed. We have simply forgotten the language to name what we feel. Spiritual warfare in ancient Sumer was not about defeating spirits. It was about remaining yourself in their presence. When identity weakens, when memory feels thin, when emotion becomes numb, the Edimu, the Utuku, and the Rabisu do not need to enter. They are already there. Ancient spirits beyond demons do not announce themselves. They reveal what has been hiding behind your awareness all along. And now more than ever, the conditions match those of Sumer's final days, when people felt lost, when the skies grew strange, when dreams felt heavier than waking. The scribes wrote that in such times, the spirits do not call you. You call them by forgetting who you are. The return is not physical. It is psychological, spiritual, instinctive. It begins in the quiet moment when a person realizes they are being observed from the inside. So the real question is not whether these spirits are returning. The question is, why are you hearing this now? Did you choose to be here? Or did something familiar, something ancient, guide you back to a memory you have not yet remembered? Now that you've seen what lies behind the oldest memories of humanity, the real question is not about the spirits themselves. It's about you. What will you do with this knowledge? Because awareness is not passive. Once you learn to recognize the signs, the stillness before sleep, the heaviness in certain rooms, the silent pause before crossing a doorway, you cannot return to the world the way you saw it before. The ancient Sumerians understood that survival wasn't about fear. It was about attention, presence, self-remembering. So ask yourself, when was the last time you felt something watching quietly from the edges of your life? Have you ever ignored a sign because you didn't want to believe it was real? And now that you know these spirits are older than demons, older than myth, older than language, can you really pretend you didn't hear the echo that brought you here? Maybe you didn't come across this by accident. Maybe something recognized you. If this awakened something in you, a memory, a question, a quiet stirring behind the ribs, then stay. There is more to uncover, and this is only the threshold. Subscribe and turn on notifications, not just to receive a new video, but to continue traveling deeper into the knowledge most of the world has forgotten. Because the path doesn't end here. It's only beginning to open.